So we ran a test and the AirPods are not necessary. Thank you, Ben, for, speaking the truth. We'll start up in just a minute when everybody comes back from break, everybody being Joseph.
Gotta get a green drink. Gotta have a wobble. Okay.
All right, so it's 10:25, we're beginning. This is a really exciting part of Romans. It's ironic because I say that like every part of Romans, but here we go. So we left off in verse 18, which is actually where we started today, but we'll keep going through chapter 8. It says, "For I consider that the suffering of this present time, sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed in us." All right, so before the break, we left off with the example of Joseph, his perspective changing when there was $100 million offered for a flick on the eyeball. Because on the front end, it looks like a terrible experience, and why would you... there's no reason to rejoice in that. But that perspective completely changes with $100 million. And this is what Paul is describing with this idea of hope. And hope is not a new idea in Romans. He's already been talking about it, especially in the first part of Romans chapter 5. It's also something that we understand as a whole, as believers, really it summarizes our perspective. Like in 1 Corinthians 13, where he says, "And now abide faith, hope, and love." And the odd thing is, within the church, we tend to focus on faith and love. In fact, most teachings you'll hear, or sermons, including mine, will fall into one of those categories. It's either about faith and living by faith, or it's more focused on love and the practical way that we interact. Our Wi-Fi, I forgot to do that.
Oh yeah, that's why.
All right.
It's back.
Okay, so sorry about that. I was going to disconnect from the Wi-Fi. Our school building Wi-Fi is not great. I'm not going to name the company that provides that, but it's not very good. So now we're streaming on my just my mobile internet. Where were we? Suffering and hope and faith, hope, and love. So the New Testament, this idea of hope really should shape everything about our perspective every day. At every moment, we are people as believers who are looking forward to eternity, who are looking forward to the glory that is going to be revealed to us in eternity. And that perspective of eternity then reshapes the way we perceive everything that we face in this life. So that's what this picture is. Me walking through life, I face suffering, but because my perspective is looking toward eternity and the glory of God, that perspective is what we call hope. And hope summarizes everything about how we as believers walk through this life with a perspective on eternity. So, this is the idea that then, if you look through the rest of chapter 8, this idea it kind of lays this foundation that everything else is taught through the lens of hope. So, we are talking about the suffering that we face. In verse 19, it says, "For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God." Okay, so the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. So there is this is going somewhere, right? The whole story of the human race it's pointing forward to something. Not just the human race, though. The whole creation itself. God's plan for his creation includes a new heaven and a new earth. It includes everything
Amen.
being redeemed. And so, when we look at the world itself, it's not just us humans that are suffering. Like right now, with the coronavirus and everything going on with that, you look around you and the animals are dying, right? Well, trees are dying. Everything is in this process of decay and death. And not just that, but it seems like the world itself is, the way it describes it is it's anxiously longing. Everything is waiting for this completion. And so whether it's hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes or all the other things, and then you think about the way that we humans experience this, and then think about the whole world and all of creation. And this is bad. This is a bad scene. You think about coronavirus, and then think about some of the possibilities, both of the financial markets and how it's going to affect human beings all over the world, and lack of food. But then you then add to that, we're going to come into tornado season or hurricane season, and if people are still in lockdown, well, what does that mean for the virus spreading even more? And you can come up with these scenarios where things get really bad, and then you look back at history, and yeah, things have been really bad. It says that the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. So this idea of the revealing of the sons of God, this is the completion of that adoption process. That what God has begun in us, he will be faithful to complete. And that process in verse 15 is described as us having received the spirit of adoption. So that spirit of adoption that we've received, and now because of that, we call him Abba, Father. Now we're looking forward to the completion of that adoption process, which is here described as the revealing of the sons of God. Verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope, we'll just keep going to 21, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So the creation itself was subjected to futility. Think all the way back to the fall. Right? It wasn't just that Adam and Eve faced condemnation for their sin. When the curse was given, right, all the way back in Genesis, the earth, the whole of creation was dealt the consequence of that. And so it says, for the creation was subjected to futility. That's this weakness, that's this decay that we all face. Not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption. So the creation, being the entire created world, will be set free from its slavery to corruption. Right? This is the slavery to corruption that the trees are decaying, that our bodies, right? I've been sitting in my house for a few weeks, and this is just the way it works. Without a lot of work, we decay. Whether it's a building that I live in is going to decay, and I have to work hard to keep it up. Actually, Todd works hard to keep up my house, so it doesn't decay. Or my body. So I've been sitting in the house for a few weeks, not exercising. Can't play basketball right now. And so on Friday, I decided to go out for a run on the spit. Todd and I drove separately. obeying all the rules, 6 feet apart, and we both ran on the spit at the same time for less than 2 miles at a really slow old man pace, and my legs still hurt. Why? Because atrophy has set in. I'm falling apart. I've been sitting around for a few weeks and my body's already out of shape. So all of creation is in slavery to this corruption. But God will set all of creation free from this slavery to corruption and into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So when we are glorified together with Him, when the sons of God are revealed, when this completion of the adoption process is finished, all of creation will participate in that.
Amen.
It's pretty extraordinary, right? That we're getting to see the end, where this is going. And again, keep in mind the context here. He's gotten into this idea of suffering, and we're reshaping our perspective on the suffering of this present time. And so the rest of this chapter is all discussing the suffering that we face in this life, and not only us, but all of creation, through the lens of God's eternal plan. All right, verse 22. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. Groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. It's kind of a childbirth. Joseph, is that a pretty brutal scene?
Yeah. My wife, she tried to hit me.
My wife did not try to hit me. She was pretty nice about it. But it's a childbirth. It's
The nurses
brutal.
laughed at me.
I still remember when we were going to have our first son, and so we were going to all this stuff, preparing to have a baby, and they put me in a room, me and Kat, with a bunch of other expecting moms and dads, and they had this big screen up there, and they put on a video about birth, and I literally felt sick. It was, I actually, so the screen's over here and all these couples are sitting here watching this thing, kind of, I think trying to desensitize us or expose us to what it was going to be like, but it was disgusting, right? Like slime and guts and screaming, and I literally turned my chair and just stared out the door of the room until the video was done, because, anyway, the pains of childbirth. But when we look at suffering on this earth, and it says the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now, we look at the suffering that the creation experiences. This is a very difficult part of our existence. It's hard to even explain philosophically why suffering exists the way it does, but it's part of our reality. And now Paul has been describing to us that we were crucified with Christ and that we're a new creation and that old things are passed away and all things will become new. And now he's needing to explain to us, well, wait a minute, why are we still facing suffering then? Well, we're in this process. We've received the spirit of adoption, but we're in this process. And so there's groaning and suffering. In verse 23, and not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. So there's the completion of the adoption picture. Now notice this. For the past few verses, he's been talking about all of creation, groaning, suffering together. But now he's talking about us, the believers. He says, not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. So that redemption of our body, right? The new heaven new earth, the glory in eternity, the new body that we will receive. That will be free of, as Revelation describes, free of suffering, free of crying, free of disappointment and shame and condemnation, free of death. Even we ourselves are groaning as we wait eagerly for our adoption. Right? We've been given the spirit of adoption, but we've not been taken home yet. And so we're calling him Abba Father. But as we wait eagerly, we're going through these trials. We're going through this suffering, right? We face this crap. And it hurts. And so we talk about rejoicing in suffering. We talk about giving thanks in all things. And at the same time, we understand, and we'll see this in a few chapters, in chapter 12, that we should mourn with those who mourn, weep with those who weep. Why? Because suffering is real. And so as we go through times of suffering and we experience this groaning, it says not only is all of creation groaning, but we are also groaning. This kind of groaning, recently Genevieve was sick and she had a sore throat and she couldn't sleep at night, and that's hard as a parent, watching a 4-year-old who can't articulate what's happening. She wasn't fully awake and she's just groaning and crying, kind of that weeping and half awake. And it's painful to watch. Every one of us as humans have experienced this, right? Not only when we were kids, but as adults. We can think of times of loss, times of pain. And sometimes it might be that you lost a ping pong game to me. You know, that's painful. And I know Joseph goes home and groans and weeps.
I do cry.
But sometimes we will experience serious loss. Right now with what's going on in our nation, there's a lot of loss, a lot of fear, and a lot of groaning. So we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. And then it points us back to this. It says, for in hope, we're at verse 24, for in hope we have been saved. But hope that is seen is not hope, for why does one also hope for what he sees? It's kind of, it's a simple statement, but it's important that we grasp this. That we hope, right? But what we hope for, it says, but hope that is seen is not hope, for why does one also hope for what he sees? Right? So if I'm seeing something, it's like if I told Joseph, hey Joseph, I've got a Bible right here that we can read.
Oh yeah, come on.
He's excited, but he doesn't have to hope that that's true. He doesn't have to hope that there's a Bible that we will be able to read. Why? Because he can see it, right? Look, you see that? It's right here. So we don't have to hope for things that we can see. This is something that ties in with our idea of faith and this whole idea of just like Abraham's faith in God, when God declared something that Abraham could not see. And the things that God declares about us, like this death to sin, and this walk of faith, that there are things in this life that we believe, even though we can't see them. We all do this in various ways, but when we're talking about within our walk with God, we believe, we hope for something that we're not seeing yet. And so, yes, right now I may be in a time of suffering, and I don't see how it's going to be good. Right? I don't see how God's going to redeem this. All I see now is loss. And yet my perspective is hope. Why? Because I look forward with expectation that the God that we trust is a God who completes what he starts.
Amen.
He's a God who keeps his word.
That's right.
And so we have hope. For in hope we have been saved. But hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one also hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we wait eagerly for it. With perseverance we wait eagerly for it. So, yes, as we face suffering in this life, we persevere. We fight. We continue on, and we do that with a sense of expectation, right? With a sense of hope, with a sense of even joy and gratitude because of the perspective we have on the glory in eternity. It says, with perseverance we wait eagerly for it. Let's look back in chapter 5. I wanted to make sure that we connect some dots here. It talks about this idea of hope and perseverance. And so I want to read this again. And we'll start in verse 2 and go through verse 5. It says, through whom also we have obtained our introduction by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we exult in hope of the glory of God. Right? That's just to remind you, biblical hope is a hope that's looking forward to the glory of God in eternity. And so, yes, we hope for things in this life also, but ultimately, biblical hope is looking toward eternity. And so there we see that we exult or we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. And not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. So we see in this passage that he starts with hope. We exult in hope of the glory of God. As a believer, we already have this hope. And then you face tribulation. And as we walk through tribulation, it builds in us this perseverance, this endurance, this patience. And as we walk through tribulation and grow in patience and perseverance with a continued perspective of hope, we grow in character and proven character. Right? There's a maturity that comes through this. And as I become the type of person that walks with proven character, with experience, this produces a different kind of hope. Well, it's the same word, it's the same hope, but it's a proven hope. It's an experienced hope. It's a hope where it says it does not make us ashamed. In verse 5 it says, and hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who is given to us. Hope.
Hope.
This hope that we have when we're on the other side of suffering is an even greater hope because it's been tested. It's been tried, it's been refined, it's been proven. And so as we walk through suffering, we can look forward to what God is doing through that suffering and rejoice in that reality. This is part of... First Peter, he says, don't be surprised when you face fiery trials as though some strange thing has happened to you. Why? Well, actually, let's look. In 1 Peter 2:21. I love this verse because it ought to reshape the way that we see our experience. It says, for you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. What's the example? Suffering. Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. And as we continue into chapter 8, we're going to see how the example of Christ's suffering, the way that he faced suffering, is an example for us in how we face suffering. But before we get there, let's just understand suffering is something we face. In this life, we still face suffering. We still face loss. And so don't be surprised by that. 1 Timothy 2:12, or 3:12, sorry, says, "And indeed all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." So as we go through suffering, Romans 8 describes this life for us with the understanding that yes, we will face persecution, yes, we will face suffering. It says that not just creation around us, but even we ourselves groan as we suffer. We should expect that. Now, as we continue forward, we're going to continue to see how this perspective of hope is shaped by the truths of Romans 8. So let's go on to verse 26. "And in the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we should. But the Spirit intercedes, the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words." Oh, I love this verse.
That's awesome.
In the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness. So there are two ways of that I experience this. One is in the middle of suffering. It's one of the most confusing and frustrating times in our lives. Right? It's as we're going through suffering that we don't have an explanation. And it's those times where we call out to God and say, "Why, God?" The difficulty is God oftentimes doesn't give us an explanation. And there we are in the midst of our suffering, saying, "Why?" And as we're crying out to God for an explanation, trying to understand, we don't know what else to say. We don't know what else to pray. I also think of times when I'm literally groaning, right? When I've been sick, I suffer from migraines, and sometimes I can get migraines bad enough that I'm vomiting and I'm hiding from all light, and I'm under the blankets in my bed, and all that's happening is groaning. Now, this is an interesting thing about prayer and language. You see, God understands all languages. He understands when someone's speaking Spanish, even though I don't understand it. He understands when someone's speaking Russian, and I don't understand it. And he understands when I'm praying in English. But God also understands the language of groaning. Why? Because even when I don't understand what I need, this is wonderful news. God's Spirit is dwelling in me and interceding on my behalf.
Amen.
It says, "In the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words." Now, one thing I think we need to point out here is this word groaning. Some people will interpret this in kind of a strange way and practice some kind of strange groaning things within the church service. I don't see this as an instruction to groan loudly in church. The key, again, as we study through Romans, is the thing we go back to is context. And so we look at the context, and you'll see that the word groan and groaning has been used 3 times now. And so we'll just look back and see in the context what groaning means. It says in verse 22 that the creation groans and suffers in pain of childbirth together until now. And then in verse 23 it says, and even we ourselves groan. And so we understand this groaning to be the type of groaning that's produced in suffering. The type of groaning that my 4-year-old daughter does when she's sick. And so as we face hardship, as we face suffering, and we find in ourselves an inability to know, to understand, articulate what we need or even what we want. The good news is, if I groan, and my groan as a child of God is directed to Him, that groan is a perfectly articulated prayer. That the Holy Spirit in me is interceding for me. And so even in the midst of suffering, when I don't understand and I don't know where to go or how to respond, and I don't even know what to pray, the good news is God is working in me through His Spirit and praying on my behalf, interceding with groanings too deep for words. Verse 27, and He who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because He intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Sometimes we struggle. Right, and we're instructed in prayer, not my will, but yours be done, because I know what I want, and I might pray what I want, but ultimately, God's will is right. God sees the whole picture. What I want from my perspective isn't necessarily what's best. It's what I think is best, and so I ask for that. But God sees the end from the beginning. He sees the whole picture, and He sees what's going on in my life, and the wise prayer, the prayer that Jesus teaches us to pray, is not my will, but yours be done. Right? Thy will be done in heaven, or on earth as it is in heaven. And so I find myself in prayer speaking to God and saying, God, this is what I want, because we're instructed to tell God what we want. And at the same time, submitting my will to Him and saying, God, ultimately I want what you want, because I know that that's better than whatever I see, whatever I want. But in this verse, we see good news that the Spirit knows. So it says, He who searches the hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because He intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So the Holy Spirit that's within me, searching my heart, knows what the will of God, who is Spirit, is, and the Spirit is interceding for me in accordance with God's will. So, even though I don't know what to say exactly, what I should be asking for, what I should be praying, the Spirit is doing that for me. In verse 28, and we know. All right, this is a well-known verse, and so we're going to take a few extra minutes on it. It says, and we know, we're going to look at this idea of knowing, that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, and to those who are called, or not and, just to those who are called according to His purpose. We know. This idea of knowing is something that Paul has referenced throughout Romans. He's made this statement many times, that we know this, like we know how the law works, or we know how this is, or there are things that we don't know, and there are things that we do know. I just want to look in context here. There are a few things, it's actually used 4 times here, and there are a few things that we know and don't know. In verse 22, it says, for we know that the whole creation groans and suffers in the pains of childbirth together until now. Right? Any human being alive on earth is aware of the suffering. We know this. In verse 26, 27, and 28, we see this in these 3 verses. In the same way, the Spirit helps our weakness, for we do not know. So it's an interesting thing. First, in verse 22, it uses the word know for what we do know. Right? We do know suffering. In verse 26, it uses the same word know to tell us, or remind us what we don't know. We don't know how to understand, how to grasp, or even what to say about our suffering. In verse 27, it's really good news, because God knows. It says, He who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is. So we do know suffering. We don't know what to say about suffering, but God does know. And then in verse 28, it goes back to something that we know. Here's what we know. God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Now again, in the context of suffering, this is something that we know, that we ought to look at when we're going through suffering. So when I face suffering in my life, I also ought to have an understanding that God is actively working good from that. Now, one thing that this verse doesn't say is it doesn't say that the suffering in itself is good. It says that God is actively working things together for good. So, coronavirus, not good. But, and let's make sure we read the whole verse, to those who are called according to his purpose. It's for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So God takes the things I face in this life, the suffering, and now God is using that for good. So God is actively working everything together for good. This is, again, ties into what we saw in Romans chapter 5, that we face suffering with the knowledge of specific things that God does. In that passage, he's highlighting the internal growth that I experienced through suffering. Right? It's almost like someone that goes through doing exercise, and you do push-ups, and there's pain involved in that. But the result of that is strength, muscular strength. But when it comes to personal character, the only way that I grow in becoming a patient person is being put in situations where I have to be patient, where I have to wait for the answer or for what I want. And so it's through those times of suffering, of waiting, that I grow in patience. And so I can see and I know that God is actively working good through that. I had a student that I was teaching who did some really stupid things a few years back and ended up in jail. And it was heartbreaking to visit him in jail and to talk about what had happened. And yeah, he was maybe, most people in prison feel like they were falsely accused, but he admitted, yes, he had done some really stupid things. So there he is in jail. And as he continued in that situation, God opened doors for him to get involved in the prison Bible studies and in the prison ministry. And because he'd been a Bible student, he was able to step up and share some of the things that he had learned through studying. And God opened doors for ministry for him there in prison. And as he was there, he begins rejoicing that God's working all things together for good. Again, as I said before, the suffering isn't good, but God has a way of working things together for good. And the same is true when it's not suffering, but when it's my own stupidity. That student's sin, his stupidity, is not a good thing. And we don't look back on that and say, man, I'm glad you're in prison now, because you have this prison ministry. No. That was bad. What he did was bad. But we serve a God who's able to redeem everything. He redeems even, his grace is greater than my sin, and he's able to overcome that.
Amen.
And so whether it's suffering that I'm facing as a result of just being a part of this broken world, or suffering I'm facing as a result of my own stupidity, God is able to take what's going on in my life, and he's able to work all things together and produce good out of that. And so maybe someone cheated on their wife and then ended up divorced, and their wife gets remarried, and they're in a terrible situation. They got to pay child support. They get to see their kids once a month, and all these situations. And later they realize that they're able to minister to other people who are going through hard situations.
Amen.
We look at that, and on the far side of it, we say, man, God has a way of working good out of that.
Yeah.
At the same time, we backtrack in that situation back to where that man was an idiot and cheated on his wife.
Yeah.
That's not good. Don't confuse this. Suffering and sin and everything else that goes into creating this scene that we have on this earth that's groaning. That's bad. But God is able to work those things together for good.
Amen.
And so as we face suffering in this life, this is good news. We know this, that we serve a God that is able to work all things together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purposes. So, in your current situation, most of you are still locked in your houses on quarantine because you traveled home. Good news. God's working this for good. I fully expect that for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purposes, that as you look to him in faith and with expectation, God is going to work in your life in ways that you'll look back on and you'll say, man, I don't know how else I would have learned or how else I would have grown in that way if it hadn't been for that situation. And yes, that doesn't make the situation good, but God is able to work good out of it. All right, normally I'd ask you all if you're getting this and if this is making sense, but you're not here. Joseph, are there any big questions popping up?
They're not.
Awesome.
But I have one.
Oh, I was going to assume that it made perfect sense and everybody got it. What's the question?
So who are the called? Like, how do you differentiate, like the believer, of course, but what about the non-believer?
So in this context, in Romans, so the Greek word, I forget the Greek word, but the Greek word for called is used actually a lot like we use it in English. Like I can call someone on the phone, or I can call from across the room and say, hey Joseph, and I'm calling you. And so when you look at the Gospels and Acts, oftentimes that's the way the word is used. But when you look at the epistles in the writings of Paul, it's primarily used in the sense of naming something. And so I call you Joseph, or God calls me a child, or God calls me a saint, or God calls me. Does that make sense? He calls me to be part of his family. And so when you look at the word called in the epistles, primarily it's used in that sense. Which is a good question because it's actually going to come up again here in a couple verses. And so when he uses the word called here, it's primarily understood in the sense of he's referring to all believers, to all who, like in chapter 1 when he's introducing this, he says, called to be saints. Why are we saints? Because God calls us saints. That when God says something, when God calls something, well, it is that. Why? Because God speaks everything into existence and at creation. So whenever God says something, like he says, Joseph, you're a saint, well, now you're a saint. Why? Because God called you a saint. So does that make sense? Called is used in the sense of naming something.
Yeah, I've done a lot of study on it, so it makes sense to me. The main reason I asked that question was like for other people. But yeah.
It's so kind of you, Joseph.
Yeah, that's right. But
all right.
Yeah.
Well, good question, and actually, we'll come back to that word here in a few verses. Are there any other questions? Because it's just about break time, so we could take a break before we jump into verse 29.
oh, it is break time.
Do you have any other questions?
Nothing, man. I've asked. No one has questions.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you guys have questions. If you do have questions, start posting them so Joseph sees them and I will answer them. Let's take a 5-minute break and we will come back and pick up in verse 29.